Chapter 1. The Guard's Silence. It was a cold evening in London when the phone rang in John Harper's modest flat. The ringtone was muffled, almost drowned out by the relentless patter of rain against the window. Harper, a retired member of the Royal Protection Squad, sat up slowly, his mind drifting back to the days when he guarded the Queen herself. He'd thought he'd left that life behind. The caller ID was blocked. He hesitated before answering, his gut already warning him. "John Harper," he answered, his voice gravelly with age and suspicion. "Mr. Harper, we need to talk," came a familiar voice, though it was more a whisper than a greeting. "It's about the night at Balmoral in 1977. You need to tell your story now." John's heart skipped a beat. Few people knew about that night. Fewer still dared to speak of it. "Who is this?" he demanded, already reaching for the drawer where he kept a small pistolet habit from his years of service. "That doesn't matter. They're coming for you, and if you don't act fast, no one will know what really happened. The public deserves to know." The line went dead. John sat for a moment in silence, his pulse quickening. His mind raced back to the summer of 1977, the night that had haunted him for decades. The night when something far beyond his understanding occurred in the heart of the royal estate. He had sworn an oath of silence, but perhaps it was time to break it. Chapter 2. Balmoral 1977. It was a warm evening in August, the Scottish sky clear and shimmering with stars. Balmoral Castle, with its sprawling gardens and centuries of history, seemed peaceful, idyllic even. John Harper, then a young and alert bodyguard, had just started his night shift, a routine patrol around the castle grounds. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II was staying at Balmoral for her summer retreat, as she did most years, away from the constant pressures of London and Buckingham Palace. The small contingent of guards, John among them, kept watch over the estate. At around 11 p.m., John had just completed a circuit of the gardens when he noticed something strange lights in the sky. At first, he assumed they were from an aircraft, perhaps military exercises, which were not unusual in the region. But these lights weren't behaving like any aircraft he had ever seen. They moved in strange, erratic patterns, as though searching for something. He radioed in to report the sighting, expecting to be met with casual indifference from the control room. Instead, there was a long silence before a voice responded. "Stay where you are. Don't make any further reports," the voice ordered, and the transmission abruptly cut off. John's instincts told him to investigate further. He moved silently through the dark, heading toward the northern edge of the estate where the lights appeared to hover. As he drew closer, the lights suddenly dimmed and vanished, leaving only the starlit sky. But the air felt heavy, electric. He crept through the trees, his hand instinctively on his sidearm. That's when he saw it, a craft, unlike anything he had ever seen, hovering just above the ground in a small clearing. It was metallic, but it shimmered in a way that defied explanation, almost as if it wasn't entirely solid. And standing before it were figures, tall, thin, with elongated limbs and large, oval eyes that reflected the moonlight. They weren't human. Chapter 3. The Visitors. John froze, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The figures, there were 3 of them, seemed to be communicating, though not with words. Their movements were smooth, deliberate, and they occasionally turned their heads as if scanning their surroundings. A cold sweat ran down John's spine as he ducked behind a tree, his mind racing. These beings, whatever they were, hadn't seen him yet. He watched in stunned silence as one of them raised a hand, causing the craft to shift and rotate slightly. Then, in an instant, they turned toward the castle. Panic surged through John. He had to warn the others, to get the Queen to safety. He fumbled for his radio, but before he could call for backup, he felt a wave of pressure in his head, a sharp, piercing sensation that forced him to his knees. His vision blurred, and for a moment, it felt like his mind was being invaded, like something was searching through his memories. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sensation stopped. John gasped for air, his body trembling as he struggled to regain control. The beings were still there, but now they were moving away from the craft, heading in the direction of the castle at an unnaturally swift pace. John forced himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his head, and ran after them. Chapter 4. The Queen's Encounter. By the time John reached the castle, everything seemed normal too normal. The lights in the royal chambers were still on, and the guards at their posts didn't seem to notice anything amiss. But John knew something was wrong. He sprinted toward the main entrance, flashing his badge to the 2 guards stationed there. "I need to see the Queen," he demanded, his voice breathless and urgent. The guards exchanged a glance, but complied. John rushed through the halls, his footsteps echoing off the polished marble floors, until he reached the Queen's private chambers. What he saw when he entered would haunt him forever. The Queen was standing in the center of the room, but she wasn't alone. One of the beings was there, standing just a few feet away from her. They were communicating, but not with words. The air in the room felt thick with energy, and John could hear a faint humming sound, like an engine running in the distance. For a moment, John thought about drawing his weapon, but something stopped him. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was a sense that if he did, things would get much worse. The Queen slowly turned to face him, her expression calm, almost serene. "John," she said, her voice steady. "It's all right." But it wasn't all right. The presence of the being, the strange energy in the room, the feeling that something was deeply wrong, it all pressed down on him, suffocating him. He stepped forward, determined to act. "Your Majesty, we need to leave. Now." The being turned its head toward John, and for the briefest moment, he felt that same sharp pressure in his mind, but this time it was weaker. The Queen nodded, as if receiving some unspoken command, and the being slowly backed away, disappearing through the wall as though it had never been there. Chapter 5. The Cover-Up. The days following the incident were a blur for John. The moment the being left the castle, the Royal Protection Squad and a group of men in suits he didn't recognize descended on the estate. John was immediately taken in for questioning. Though it was clear they weren't looking for answers, they were there to keep him quiet. The men government agents, no doubt, spoke little, but their message was clear. The event at Balmoral had never happened. John was to forget everything he had seen and done that night. For the sake of national security, for the Queen, and for his own life, he was to remain silent. He was given a small fortune to retire early, along with a document to sign. In that moment, John realized just how deep this conspiracy ran. He signed the papers, knowing full well that refusing wasn't an option. For years, John kept his silence, living a quiet life in London, haunted by what he had seen. He was bound by duty, by fear, by the weight of secrets too dangerous to reveal. But now, after all these years, something had changed. That phone call had shaken him from his complacency. The public had a right to know the truth, and perhaps there was still time to make things right. Chapter 6. The Truth Unveiled. John packed a small bag and left his flat, knowing he could never return. The men who had covered up the events of Balmoral wouldn't let him walk away from this. But if he could get his story out first, maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally see the light of day. He drove for hours, crossing into the countryside, where he knew an old journalist friend who might still be able to help. But even as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something human or otherwise was closing in on him. When he arrived at his destination, the house was dark, the windows shattered. His friend was nowhere to be found. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the gravity of the situation. There was no escaping this. But he had one last move to make. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and began to type out the events of that night, sending the files to every media outlet and government watchdog he could think of. He didn't care what happened to him anymore. The world had to know. As he hit send, there was a knock at the door. John took a deep breath, standing up to face whatever came next. The truth was out there now, and no matter what they did to him, they couldn't take that back. The door opened slowly, and standing in the threshold was a figure John recognized all too well. The tall, thin form of one of the beings from that night at Balmoral. Epilogue. The darkest secret. In the brief silence that followed, John felt a profound sense of finality wash over him. His pulse thundered in his ears, and his breath caught in his throat. The creature, as tall and otherworldly as it had been all those years ago, stared at him with its large, reflective eyes. Its presence filled the room, distorting reality, And John knew in that moment that this was not simply an encounter with a physical being, this was an entity beyond human comprehension. The alien raised one hand, palm outward. The humming in John's ears grew louder, vibrating through his skull. He felt an inexplicable wave of calm wash over him, mixed with the overwhelming sense of inevitability. It wasn't here to harm him, not yet, at least. It was here to make sure that John's story never truly surfaced. "I know what you are," John said hoarsely, though his voice shook. "I know what you're capable of. But it's too late. The world will know what happened that night. You can't stop it." The creature made no move, no sound. It simply stood there, watching him. It was waiting. It had always been waiting. John felt his legs grow weak, his mind struggling to hold onto rational thought. The reality of what he had uncovered, what he had lived with for so many years, was collapsing around him. He had spent his life protecting the Queen, protecting secrets, but this was beyond anything he had been trained for. And now, as he stood face to face with the being, he understood why the events at Balmoral had been so carefully hidden. The world wasn't ready for this truth. Perhaps it never would be. But it didn't matter. The story was out there now. Or so he thought. The alien shifted slightly, and John suddenly felt an intense pressure on his chest. He gasped for air, stumbling back as invisible hands seemed to squeeze the life out of him. His vision blurred, his head spun. He dropped to his knees, the weight on his chest growing unbearable. He was dying. The realization hit him like a shockwave. The entity wasn't just here to silence him, it was here to erase him. In those final moments, as the world around him began to fade, John Harper had one last, fleeting thought. "I was never meant to tell this story." With a final, shallow breath, everything went black. Aftermath. A vanished legacy. The next morning, the police arrived at the small house in the countryside to find John Harper's body slumped in the doorway, his face pale, eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of terror. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack, an unexpected tragedy for a man his age, but not unusual enough to raise any red flags. The emails John had sent never reached their recipients. Every message he had drafted, every file he uploaded had been quietly intercepted, erased as if they had never existed. The world moved on, blissfully unaware of the darkness that had briefly brushed against it. The Queen remained silent, as did the royal family. Balmoral Castle continued to stand, its ancient walls holding secrets that would never be revealed. The night of 1977 was quietly forgotten by those who had been involved, buried under layers of classified documents and sworn oaths. But deep in the halls of the British government, in a room few ever entered, there was a file, one marked with a simple name. Harper Incident, Balmoral 1977. It was a case that would never see the light of day, its contents hidden from even the highest officials. But the file still existed, and the truth it held remained, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon it. Somewhere in the shadows, the beings watched, and they waited.